In the city where we live, an organized crime syndicate once burnt down an entire floor of the National Bank because someone threatened to fire an employee that was working for them. If you drive past the road on which that bank is built, the marks of that burnt building are still there. We think that organized crime syndicates, by their very necessity, inspire fear in people and use excessive force and violence to protect their own interests. By virtue of the fact that they make all of their money off of their crime operations, their purest incentive is to protect it by any means necessary. This often looks like doing things like the spectacles at National Bank. These often look like doing things like specifically targeting individuals who threaten to speak out against them. Cool. Having clarified that, what are we going to prove in this debate? We're going to prove two very simple things. Firstly, why it is justified to label them as such, irrespective of potentially utile outcomes. Secondly, why this does actually translate into better utile outcomes. Lastly, I'm going to do a bit of preemption with regards to any potential arguments from opposition. Cool. Firstly, let's talk about why it's principally justified, irrespective of like any potential utile outcomes that opposition brings up. We think that firstly, what characterizes a terrorist group in a legal sense is two things. Firstly, that they have to cause egregious harm to the public, and secondly, that they have to cause egregious harm to the perception of safety of the public. By virtue of the fact that these people have a direct incentive to inspire fear in other people, right? It looks like when in The Godfather, they threaten witnesses with like excommunication, or threaten witnesses with like by sending them like fucking horse heads in the boot of their car. We think this generally translates into creating this atmosphere, not just in specific individuals who are involved with the crime syndicate, but also with society at large, where you make them fear you by force. Because in the event that they stop fearing you, they could potentially take you down. This is why you have things like targeted killings by these crime syndicates. This is why you have things like intimidation. This is why you have things like safety taxes that they often collect from people, specifically to tell them that so long as you pay us and cooperate with us, we won't do anything to you. However, if you stop paying us, consequences are incurred. Cool. Given that they do this, why is this so principally unjustified, irrespective of potentially utile outcomes? Firstly, we think that harms that harm a perception of society, perception of safety in general, are valued substantially more by the justice system than harms that harm a victim directly in isolation. This is why when we're looking at hate crimes, for instance, we value them substantially more and punish them more in comparison to like a regular crime against a normal member of any standard community, right? Because they're not just a crime against an individual, they are a crime against the perception of safety overall. This is why we think we hold them to a higher standard in principle. Secondly, we think that we pursue them to the fullest extent of the law, and in a lot of cases beyond, because specifically they take away from the state's capacity to protect these individuals, right? It takes away from their capacity to experience life on a day-to-day basis, right? Because you're no longer just like strolling down to the park. You are clutching at your phone, clutching at your purse, praying for a feeling of safety that you don't look the wrong way at some member of like XYZ gang. We think that this kind of like constant atmosphere of fear creates such a net loss of utility that these individuals have no other option. We think that as a result of this, they are justified in pursuing them to a substantially greater degree than like a standard criminal organization. Cool. Why as well do we think this should be valued above all futile outcomes in this round? We think that in principle, the justice system does not exist only to maximize outcomes. If it existed only to maximize outcomes, we'd probably either have no prisons if all we cared about was like the general well-being of the population. We'd just have rehabilitation centers. Or we'd have like everybody locked up if we wanted to minimize crime, because all that matters is that no crime happens whatsoever. I think the justice system prides itself on being both some degree of utile, but also extremely fair and extremely justified, and protecting the sense of utility and the sense of safety in status quo. We think this should be valued substantially more than any potential outcomes that like opposition bench brings up. I'm also going to tell you is how this leads to completely better outcomes in status quo. Notice the structure of these organizations, right? They frequently have habits that particularly make them extremely difficult to persecute. What do those habits look like? We think that they often have hierarchical structures with efficient roles assigned specifically to cover up their tracks and make sure that nothing happens, right? There are people assigned the roles of like cleaning up evidence. There are people who are assigned like roles of witness murdering. And in addition to that, there's also the general atmosphere of fear that prevents people from coming forward in the first place. We think that given that all of this exists, there's already a substantially large barrier to entry whenever you are obtaining any evidence against these people or making sure that it exists. They often also have people on the payroll, people in like the law enforcement directly on their payroll, which means that like standardized law enforcement often is incapable of taking them down. We think that you do three things that are extremely essential here. Firstly, you allow the police to like have some capacity to gather evidence by like reducing like the standard measures, like having to obtain evidence legally, by allowing things like wiretapping, allowing a substantially greater amount of like interference in these people's personal lives to get that evidence, which is so necessary. But secondly, you also make sure that they are interacting with a different group now, which perhaps they have less people in their pocket in general. Notice as well that like these organized crime groups often have truly incredible arsenals. So they have substantial amounts of weaponry that they, again, maintained to protect their own interests, because in the event that they are threatened, they will defend themselves. And secondly, they often have like a degree of like every member of that group is often like intimidated into being a huge part of it. We can do two more things, right? Firstly, you allow the law enforcement to have a chance of fighting back when you have military grade personnel fighting against them. Secondly, you also have the capacity to do like targeted operations by reaching out to snitches, right? You can get people specifically in line, and by virtue of the fact that you criminalize membership as a whole, we think that like you're generally complicit in the event that you join this group. But secondly, even if like we recruit lower level people and give them plea bargains, what you can do is you can use them to set up sting operations and get more targeted information, which you otherwise can't because they operate in the shadows. Cool. Having clarified all of that, I'll take a point from closing.
So I think we can agree with your characterization that that they're dangerous or that they're bad, for example. But that still doesn't take away from like the benefits brought about by like social services in less developed countries provided by these organized crime syndicates.
Cool. We don't think that that specifically matters. We think that if the state does fail to fulfill its obligations, then like the state should simply do better in those areas. Right? We don't think that like providing some social benefit takes away from the harm that you've done. We don't think that it is justified, for instance, for somebody who does a lot of charity to get away with fucking murder. We don't think that that's an intrinsically justified thing for opposition to run. If that's what they're going with, then I wish them the best of luck. Last thing on one more idea, which is going to be coercion, that I'm hoping like some smart opposition team is going to try to bring up. We think that choice essentially is a spectrum, right? It doesn't matter if you were pressured by society or pressured by your financial conditions. The decisions that you make as an adult are binding, right? The decisions that you make are specifically things that you have to pay consequences for. If you get a job, you have a contract, you have to care for it. It doesn't matter if you were forced into that job, we still hold you accountable on a legal level. Secondly, we think that like if there are cases of children, probably those are going to be the severe minority. But secondly, even in those instances existing, we frequently treat them very differently in status quo as well. Like when we get kids from like terrorist organizations, we often re-educate them rather than locking them up in prison for the rest of their lives. It's likely to be done in a strategic manner. Panel, we've proven to you how, like in principle, irrespective of what happens, it is fundamentally justified and necessary to do this. And secondly, on a utile level, we've also proven how you cannot take them down in the absence of these measures. For all those reasons, vote opening government.
All right, I think that speaker and
One, any government that feels the need to just let a crime syndicate run as they do because they provide some so-called benefit to society doesn't deserve to rule as a state in the first place, right? But I think we get a very, very weird conception of what these organized crime syndicates look like in the first place from the opening opposition, right? Because if we're to believe them, and this is a line that they said multiple times within the LO speech, right? That why should they be punished for just wanting to make a simple amount of money when they're providing a benefit to society? Look, I think two things are to note here. First, I think this is a very, very specific description of these crime syndicates. Like you're possibly only looking at those that are happening in some countries in Latin America. Like a lot of countries have crime syndicates who are doing a lot of horrible shit and not necessarily providing welfare. And even if they are providing welfare, we don't think that creates a justification for you to actively just let these crimes go. And it doesn't necessarily take away the ability of the state to do this, right? I think it's important to note something very clearly on the top of the speech because opposition teams can't run this idea that if the government isn't providing a social services and these crime syndicates are doing it, they should just leave them be, right? I think this is a ridiculous premise, right? Because if the government has given up on providing social services in the first place and is so reliant on these crime syndicates, I don't think that's very much within the ambit of this debate, and government wouldn't have a horse in the race. And I don't think the motion is that fundamentally broken, right? The question then becomes about whether or not you should let these crime syndicates run, right? I'm going to give a couple of key bits of weighing here as to why you should not let this happen, even in the case of best case of opposition, which is them providing these mass amounts of benefits and, just wanting to make a little bit of money on the side. I don't know how they'd be a crime syndicate then in that case, if that's the characterization you want to go for. Let's start off with the first thing. Look, if you want to talk about individuals who are here and, in these crime syndicates who are here and maybe coerced into this, maybe doing this because they have no other choice. Note that choice is a spectrum, right? We still hold individuals accountable for whatever they do, right? Despite the circumstances that they may be in. It is the sole duty of the state to be able to do this, right? If a crime syndicate has told someone to, go out of their way to murder someone or has gone into stealing something, it's likely you're still going to persecute that person. Maybe not to the highest extent possible, but you're still going to necessarily persecute them, right? And at the end of the day, the crime syndicate is still necessarily doing this, right? This is the major issue that comes here at opposition, right? The second thing to note is that they talk about this idea that, we're going to face a lot of backlash if this happens, right? Because the government is so scared of this godfather-like figure that's holding a gun to their head and going to ruin their lives if this necessarily happens, right? I think that's a very weak government that opposition has presented. And secondly, I don't think this is enough of a reason not to pursue this, mostly because of the mechanisms that have been provided to you by Mahat's speech, right? When you label these organizations as terrorist groups specifically, and when you go out of your way to make sure that these are labeled as groups that are causing damage within society and that are actively inspiring a notion of fear within society, you're able to get a lot more support, right? Because in a lot of cases, yes, they have a lot of influence and they have a lot of ability to, have their pockets in law enforcement. They have the ability to get rid of evidence. What you have then is the ability to get outside support, right? Stuff like the military and organizations like that aren't necessarily something that these crime syndicates can tap into, right? So you have the ability to take them down in ambits where they cannot control. So that's you taking down these crime syndicates and making sure that you're getting rid of them, right? But also, I want to note that this is, I want to note this particular thing about this idea of whether or not this is a welfare, whether or not they're providing welfare, right? I think this is a big problem in opposition's case and generally something that comes out of CO as well. Even if they're providing this, we think it's very justified to do this for the principal reason with what we've given within this debate when you get this additional support, right? I'll quickly move on to some of the clashes and why opening government is pretty much very clearly taking it on multiple levels, right? I'll first start off with the principle, right? Because I think this is particularly important and something that should be weighed highly in the round, right? Because states right now have a duty to their citizens and states particularly have a duty to create an aura of safety, right? We think most of the time in the vast majority of characterizations, these crime syndicates are causing an active harm within society. They're inspiring a notion of fear. And note, this isn't limited to just them providing these social services or providing jobs, right? Even if this is the case, right? Because in a vast majority of circumstances, the reason crime syndicates have such control over the economy or the areas of those cities is because they force local businesses to shut down. They force other things to, get out of the way and basically forcefully take control of resources within that region, right? That's what makes them a crime syndicate in the first place, right? You want to necessarily snatch away that power and help people within this region actively gain ability to get back this power, right? Which is why the principle needs to be highly weighed in this round, right? Because when you label them as a terrorist group, and this is exactly what they are, they're instilling a level of fear and they're going out of their way to ruin this for people, right? And I want to note here, this is not going to be necessarily problematic for those individuals who are coerced in the first place, or even children in this case, if that's something that opposition wants to run, right? Because even if they're labeled as a terrorist group, Note that this just means the way in which we investigate and take them out becomes slightly more aggressive, but note the way that they'll be tried will probably still be something along the lines of, if a coerced individual is there, they can probably come to some sort of deal. Even if a kid is from a terrorist organization, they're tried very, very differently to, say, an adult or a ringleader from that organization, right? So we think in this case, it's very, very justified for you to go and pursue these terrorist groups. Before I move on to how even on the practical, I'll take something from closing, hopefully.
So I think your speech has just talked about why is it that they're so bad and why we need to do something about it, which we don't disagree with, but we think you haven't met the burden of why you should be labeling them a terrorist group in the first place.
Great. I'm moving on to that right now in the practical. So why labeling them as terrorist groups is particularly going to solve this issue, right? Note the mechanisms that Mahat gives you in this speech and why this is particularly important, right? This additional support by labeling them as terrorist groups is something that becomes particularly important, right? Because note, no amount of backlash is going to be even weighed up worth the current damage that's being caused to you politically, in the economy, in your country as a whole, right? This damage can be counteracted when you label these organizations as terrorist groups. Why is this the case? This means that you can pursue areas outside of pursue much more stronger policies in terms of going out of your way to, take out these members within them, wiretap their phones or call in the military to actively take these things out, which is particularly helpful within this case because these are the areas where these crime syndicates do not have influence within this case, right? These are the areas where you can actively get that additional support to help them in the first place, right? And this is the only way to do it when you label them as these terrorist groups, right? Because normally, a lot of the time, due to the nature of these organizations and the influence they have within these spheres, it's why you can't pursue them through means like such as law enforcement, right? Because a cop can get rid of evidence or they can go and kill a witness, right? These things go out of the way when you have that additional support coming in from areas like the military, from even international organizations, when you label them as a terrorist group, and then you have every bit of support you can to get them out of the country, get them out of this and take away their power, right? Panel, look, it's fairly straightforward. We think principally states are very, very justified in doing this because of the exact sort of damage crime syndicates are causing. We don't think any sort of benefit that they provide necessarily justifies their existence in the first place. And we think labeling them as terrorist groups particularly will improve outcomes vastly, especially when you can bring in that additional support and make sure to get rid of them outside the spheres where they have influence. We think for all these reasons, you should give this debate to the opening government. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
So the fourth thing that opening government tells us is that we mischaracterize those groups. So they say, we believe that one thing about them, the biggest, those groups, like the biggest syndicates are in the states co-located in the Latin American countries in which government power is pretty weak. Why is this? Because at the point in which government power is weak, you have all the opportunities to develop your power and be, as we characterized already. But secondly, though, even if this motion is not only about the syndicates located in Latin America, in most parts of the world, syndicates are closely mixed up with businesses and governments because it's the best way to hide your incentive, to hide your deals, right? So still this characterization stands. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is about justification. We believe that opening government still does not do a good job as justifying those people as terrorists, because the only thing that they tell you is that the amount of fear that society has like justifies them as terrorists. However, we do not believe that fear is the only thing that can serve as a justification, because fear, of course, happens in daily life, in like all the people's life. You have fear not to be murdered, not to lose jobs. However, it does not necessarily mean that the subject that makes you fear is exactly terrorist, right? So Altanay, like my partner tells you that the first thing is the extent of the harm and the type of the harm. That's to say, in most of the cases, terrorist attacks do massive harms that kill people. However, the goal of the syndicates is to have more power, is to have more economical power that opening government also concedes. What does it mean? It means that it is in most of the cases crime not against humanity, but rather crime against government power. and it is problematic. Why? Because government power is not an absolute thing, because government power in most of the countries, maybe there is authoritarian governments, maybe like comes from election, but it's not absolute thing. And we cannot say like, if you are decreasing government power, so you are terrorist, right? You are just changing one government to the another in the form of the organized group syndicate. But secondly, though, they say that those groups are very hard to tackle because of their web networks, etc., etc., and this is why we should classify them as terrorists. However, we do not believe that this is a reason to classify them as terrorists, because it's not a blame of them like being smart, but a blame to the government. That's it's the government's inability to tackle them. It's government's inability to fight with them, and we do not believe that because of the government's weakness, they should be classified as terrorists. Because apart from that, they are they are the same as individual criminals. They are the same as individual murderers, or the same as individual like financial criminals, right? So we do not believe that it is justified. So second thing, like, what is the most probable reaction to it, and what are the most probable impacts? We believe that on our side of the house, who will suffer is actually civilians, are the common people. Why is it? One thing, we believe that in the status future, government will most probably use torture, because torture is like unjudicial way of gathering information, and in most of the Latin American countries also is used against terrorists, right? So who this torture is likely to be used against? We believe that this torture will be like against civilians who work for those syndicates. That's say in most of the regions in which you do not have an opportunity to find the work, but to work for those people, like raise marijuana and other agricultural stuff, you do not have another opportunity coming from the government, and you have to work. Most probably government will torture them to have certain information. However, in most of the cases, it will be unsuccessful, because those those organized syndicates hide information. They hide people who can give information, and it's very hard for you to find them. But second thing, in most of the cases, they use human shields. That's to say, like, they are closely located to the civilians. They are closely located to the people in the cities. So, which means that even if you will find them, even if you will make a war against them, it will have a huge like collateral damage to the population, a huge collateral damage. Why is it? Because you give them no other alternative than to defend themselves, because they have guns, they have like massive arsenal, as opening government tells you. And do you think that they will just like hide or just go to the prison by their own choice? No, because being terrorist means like maybe death sentence, maybe like just being killed without any judicial information, which means that you have to defend themselves, you have to take guns. And in that cases, when they use human shields in most of the cases, or located closely to the people, just civilians will also suffer. POICG.
Yeah, in the status quo, you also punish, for example, theft out of survival, because regardless of their intention, there's still bad impacts that come from that particular actions. Why is it any different under result?
Yeah, we believe that status quo, maybe in the status quo, we are failing to tackle them. However, status future action will make things worse. And it's very important for us not to make those things worse. So the third reason why those civilians are very likely to suffer in most of the cases. So at the point in which all teams concede that those syndicates have a huge amount of power and a huge amount of economical capability, like even if government side is likely to win the war against the syndicate, even if government side is likely to be efficient and pressuring those syndicates, what will happen in the future? They are not going to go to the prison. However, what's likely to happen is that they will take all their money, all their finances, and fly to other developed countries, or other like islands, for example, right? And you cannot really track them. Like for ease, it's very hard to track them, right? So why is it very hard? Because in most of the cases, it means that taking away money, taking away businesses, it means that most people are likely to lose their jobs. That's say many people working in the agriculture spheres, many people working in other spheres are likely to lose their jobs. But it's not only about jobs, but also millions and millions of dollars going away from the developing country to other, to other banks or offshores that are very hard to tackle in the status quo because they have a web of those networks and they are very efficient in hiding their resources, while in the status quo they may invest those resources in certain spheres, right? So we believe that given the context of those countries, given the context of insufficient power of the government, insufficient power of the economy, it's crucially important for the population as well to have those syndicates. And we believe that it's totally unjustified, both principally and practically, proud to oppose.
Currently, a lot of really huge crime syndicates are already categorized as terrorist groups, right? Boko Haram, ISIS, Taliban, they all started out as organized crime syndicates. The drug cartel of Los Zetas in Mexico, for example, recruited Mexican military members and operate as a paramilitary group. So they are treated as a terrorist organization anyway, regardless of its label. So in order to have some sort of exclusivity in this debate, we can't just talk about huge crime syndicates. We should also justify why small crime syndicates, probably those with low number of victims or death counts, should also be classified as terrorist groups where you kill them outside of court, where you criminalize mere membership, right? The arguments coming from opening government are decent, and we agree with most of the things that they said. Unfortunately, they didn't really, all of their analysis are highly dependent on these groups being ultra violent, ultra aggressive, and they don't really talk about small crime groups, right? So closing government will tell you several things. First of all, why the strength of organized crime syndicates comes in its recruitment and its huge amount of members. Second of all, why being associated with terrorist groups and the infinite additional risks like extrajudicial killings or criminalizing membership deters people from joining groups, thus taking away their strength. But and third of all, why this also cuts off the sources of income for these crime syndicates, which also in turn cuts off their strength. This is something that opening government hasn't discussed and will be dissected in closing government. But before moving on to my extension, I have several points of rebuttals, right, towards the opposition side of the house. So opening opposition talks about how this is going to be super aggressive and it will impact citizens. But we think that this is actually very technical, right? If your problem is harming civilians, then all you have to do is try to investigate better, right? We think that this is also within the interest of the state because the entire reason why they wanted to treat these organized crime syndicates as like terrorist group is because they want to protect citizens. So most likely they will be able to investigate which people are being used as human shields against their will and which one are willingly doing it, like taking up arms because they're loyalists, right? We think that they are able to like find out which one is actually guilty, like what my whip has POI'd, and they were able to take the justified course of action. If they are willingly taking up arms, then they can also be killed along with these other terrorist group members, and that's why we don't think that opening opposition can fare very well in the debate. So I'm going to move immediately to my extension, right? I'm going to talk about why the strength comes in number, which is from recruitment. There are 3 reasons for this. First of all, it's because they recruit people from different jobs and different socioeconomic levels in society, right? They recruit people in the high up, like judges, lawyers, people in the government, really rich people who can provide like connections and like money to their income. But also they recruit people living in red light districts and with huge connections so that they have a shit ton of loyalists they can use. If not for their brains or their hard skills, like people with like really good jobs, being able to like free them from jail, it's also for them to take the fall when they're being investigated or for them to pick up weapons and fight for them, right? Even if these people that are being recruited, like the low-level ones, don't commit crime, they at least will be loyalists and won't report on crimes that they see, and this adds up to their strength, right? But second of all, it's because they're everywhere, so it's easier to distribute their products, like drugs, for example. And it increases their incomes because they can reach more customers, they can influence more people in making bad decisions or buying illegal items from them. But also they have hundreds of people who can cover up each other's tracks and making it very easy for the law enforcement to, very hard for the law enforcement to investigate the case and very easy for them to go off track, right? But third of all, it's because they infiltrate and take control of cities by making sure the majority of people are on their side. They attack insurgencies of people or people who want them gone in their city, and this results in them having like multi multiple bases, right, where they can produce their drugs without like getting known by the law enforcement because it's covered up like a legit business, ladies and gentlemen. We think that as a conclusion, this means syndicates who are small and are way below law enforcement's radar because they are seen as not dangerous yet, because they don't have a lot of victims yet, are on their track to be just as dangerous as groups that operate as paramilitaries, right? We think that there are no organized crime groups that started out as huge crime syndicates. All of them start small. It's the ability to recruit more members that allows any group to commit more horrendous acts, to kill more people and to fend off government power, which is why this is the most important thing in debate, right? Being able to recruit more people. So what is the harm in their side of the house? We think that the current system doesn't allow law enforcement to prevent them from recruiting, right? Exactly because what opening opposition said is that they provide some kind of benefit to people, right? They have the right to join without being criminalized, not until the police can prove that they're committing some kind of crime. For example, if the fact that they're also distributing drugs, just being like a loyalist under their name wouldn't get them like deterred. It wouldn't, and it's very easy for these crime syndicates to say that it's okay for you to just join. We're gonna provide you benefit. You don't have to do anything with us yet. And after 3-4 years staying with them, they're gonna pick up arms by their own account, right? At this rate, all small crime syndicates have all huge potential to be just as big. This resulted into like literally all the terrorist organizations that become big in this world and became a terrorist threat to the US, right? For example, the fact that Taliban used to be like are almost completely obliterated when there's a war in Afghanistan, but then they become twice even stronger and almost beat the US military because they grow just from recruitment alone, ladies and gentlemen. So what's going to happen in our side of the house, right? How does our mechanization solve the problem that we've been explaining? There are 4 points on this. First of all, because association is criminalized, right? Just the mere membership is going to get you to jail, for example. Most likely people that are recruited from the ground will be scared, right? It's because the majority of recruits don't start as professional criminal or people who are already embracing the life of crimes, willing to jump from buildings to buildings and like distributing drugs, right? The majority of people who are being distributed are like families who are families and young people who are still like regular civilians, and they can be scared of being criminalized, and the mere fact of being a member can directly put them to jail, will already deter them. But second of all, this is going to be blown up by media, right? When government consider an organization as terrorist, an organized crime syndicate as a terrorist organization. The label in and of itself might deter the majority of citizens who are still on the fence of joining, like people in the gray area. Like for example, like opening opposition said, people seeking for protection would think twice before joining because it might be counterproductive, as they might end up behind jail, right? They might lose the like guardianship to their children, for example. They might lose their loved ones, even while the reason why they wanted to join in the beginning was to protect their loved ones. But third of all, we think that recruits are usually told by these crime syndicates that they're going to be safe, that we're going to protect you, that you don't have to commit to high-end crimes just yet. But now that everyone can be extrajudicially killed and everyone is faced with the same risk as these higher ends, like the elites, it will get them scared from joining, right? They will be afraid of like, because most people are like afraid of that. Even if they're not afraid of being caught by law enforcement, the mere thought that just being a part of it can kill them is very scary. But lastly, and most importantly, it's going to take away income, because now people are afraid from buying from a terrorist organization and being seen as someone who is associated with them and can also be caught and killed, right? We think that the fact that they can no longer have income also takes them away, like take away their weapon, and that's what we beg to propose.
What? So I want to talk about 2 things. First, on principle, on how you delegitimize the justice system within stable countries or countries with all-right state structures. And second, on how you create a lack of accountability in broken state structures. First, on how you delegitimize the justice system within stable state structures or all-right state structures, right? Because we do recognize that like the point of which there are crime syndicates means that there's some level of brokenness within the countries, but then the fact that they have the ability to, think about these policies or have some level of policing means that the state structures aren't completely broken yet. I think this was the main context that was set up in the opening house. I think the comparative in CO, and this is important, is that why are legal mechanisms incredibly important? This particular extension is important because first, I think only explains the differences in interest between the terrorist groups and between crime syndicates, but doesn't actually explain the comparative. And they do come close when Diao says that torture is unjudicial, but this doesn't actually tackle or show further levels of comparisons. But second, OG then tells you things about how we take away the state's capacity to protect individuals, and this allow people to experience life on a day-to-day basis. But I think this was the main crux of the case, which will be taken down by the comparison I'm going to show you now. I think we co-opt all the harms that OG talked about and stated, because we do agree that murder and crimes are generally bad for society, but we do think that states also have a responsibility. But the way in which the state does this is incredibly important. Why? First, if you weed these crime syndicates out through legitimate means, i.e. you don't actually have extrajudicial killings, or you don't immediately jump the gun and not give them a fair trial, or you don't just take random evidence, for example, means that no one within the state, within these OK structures, can say that it's illegitimate or have a lesser incentive to say that you didn't give them a fair trial, and then therefore leads to lesser backlash. Because I think OG's mechanism assumes that they're able to get the benefits like information, they're able to get the network of crimes, but no, we don't think that's possible, because one, why would they give you information willingly with this label on them? But second, we think that this assumes that the level of crime that they do or that they commit are as high as terrorists, that they have genocidal tendencies, or that they self-radicalize other individuals. I think these are things that are drastically lower on outside the house. But even if we do accept their premise, we think that crime syndicates exist in communities, and people generally support these crime syndicates in these impoverished communities. That means that you create a lot more incentive for backlash by these individuals, because they see that the crime syndicates that is actually giving them the minimal standard of living are actually being unfairly tried. I think these are things that causes backlash against other individuals. But second, I think we also ensure that fewer people join these crime syndicates. I think this is a crucial mechanism, because this clashes with the idea of deterrence throughout the government's bench. Why do people join crime syndicates to begin with? One, I think that there's no structures for these impoverished individuals to fall back on, or second, because of circumstances, or third, because they just want to do crimes, for example. But one, we think that on the outside the house, fewer people will join them because you increase the stability and trust within the judicial system. That means that the point at which you tell individuals that we aren't going to randomly excommunicate you, or we aren't going to randomly kill you without any sort of trials, means that people are less likely to violently commit these crimes, because they do know and that there's some sort of law and order within the country itself. But second, you also ensure that there's fewer crimes to clamp down in the future by the government, because at the point at which you reduce the amount of crimes that's actually happening within the country itself, or fewer people joining this crime syndicates, that means that you have increased ability to have resources, and you can channel these resources therefore to build up the social support structures for these individuals, i.e. to have maybe more governmental support, or i.e. to have hotlines and help for these individuals, which prevents them and takes away the tipping point for them to even want to join the crime syndicates. Why is this important? Because we recognize that we cannot go back in time to prevent individuals from joining the crimes, but we can prevent future individuals from joining, to prevent further harms, and to then channel resources to improve and build up the support structure, assuming that the state has some level of capacity. But third, we also think that you show that the law has the ability and the capacity, right? Because you ensure that the societies, because we think that society scrutinizes them, we think society looks at them for this sort of judicial stability, and the best way to stop people from joining is to ensure they put themselves up in that pedestal, and you aren't just going to arbitrarily and create a propensity for abuse on your side of the house. But lastly, we think that a more likely scenario than fear, because OG says that you use fear to prevent people from joining, is that you actually ensure that you don't create self-radicalized terrorist individuals at the point which create these labels. Second, you don't ensure that they rally against poverty or against state structures. And third, you just ensure that they don't go against the state in general. I think all of this means that fewer people will join these crime syndicates, because there's less incentive for them to join at the point at which you have increased social support structure. But last, we think that in the long term, you also ensure that you strengthen the government structures to clamp down on future crimes and future possibility of terrorism rising within the countries, and just ensure that you go in within these crime syndicates, you create the environment that you're going to do it legitimately. I think this is the main principle that we stand for in CO. But when they're considered localized crime, then we think that you can deal with them on a much efficient and effective level, as opposed to just out of the house, where you just go in and you just and I think there's no sort of mechanism to ensure any level of accountability and check and balances within the system. And this is detrimental, because it delegitimizes the justice system and creates more incentive for people to join the crime syndicates. But before I move on, I'll take a POI from OG.
CG is just us with deterrence. Terrorist groups also provide welfare, do business, exist in weak states, and are hard to prosecute with backlash occurring. Why do we still label them as terrorist groups, and why do we still take away their judicial rights? Our principal criteria is unchallenged.
no, we don't, and that's why you don't label them as terrorist groups, because you don't want to, because the level of crimes that they commit within the local level and crimes that terrorist groups commit is like throughout the world, it's like incredibly different. I think the point of which you create these labels means that you create more incentive for them to go against you, to create more backlash and violence within society. Second, how you create a lack of accountability in broken state structures then. I think that directly clashes with CV's point about propping up crime syndicates. We think it wasn't on their side of the house in these states. Why? The premise of the argument is that one, the states within these broken state structures have incentive of money and to maintain and to entrench their power within these LDCs, for example, or within these countries. The elite in the governments often have ties with these reigning mafia groups, and that's how they attain the legitimacy and continuously get backed up and the powers continuously gets entrenched. We know this, for example, in the Italian mafia when they have strong ties with the government, or for example, the intersection of mafia and church also means that the mafia has a significant ability to infiltrate these state institutions. Therefore, we think that states don't actually have the incentive to label these very strong groups as terrorism, because the level of crime is just something that they do agree with, because they are able to get funding, they are able to work closer with them. There's no check and balances at the end of the day. The impacts are twofold. First, you have a greater incentive to incorrectly label a few groups there, because legitimate groups that committed minimal level of crimes are then labeled as terrorist groups because the governments want to entrench the actually worse crime syndicates. But second, you also label political parties to oust their political opponents to keep their state up and running. Third, we think that more people will join the syndicate because they want to be part of the safe group that's protected by the state. Last, I think it's difficult for international pressure to clamp down on these countries in the long run at the point in which the power is so deeply entrenched within the mafia syndicates and within the state. I think these are things that create lack of accountability within the state, and that's why you cannot ever weed out all these problems and solve and create a democratic nation for these states. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
One, I think opening oppositions and closing oppositions all really rely on minimizing the harm that comes from these criminal syndicates, and also the fact that they're such a huge contributory towards civilians, and therefore we need to still respect them in a way, because we don't want to be all aggressive, even if there's a lot of explanations about why they're a crime organizations, right? If I can prove to you why, at the end of the day, even the best case scenario where they can provide benefits from society, if I can prove to you why that benefit aren't going to be sustainable and it's not enough for us to justify why we can't be aggressive towards them, I think, and to minimize the possibility of them expansion by limiting their recruitment process, for example, we won't, right? Because all of their narrative and benefit rely on that characterizations. We're talking about when we're talking about crime syndicates, right? Regardless how small or big it is. In Mexico, for example, the impact is very huge. They seize cities and hang dead bodies of insurgents in the street to scare people. So you cannot just talk about crime syndicates that are very, very laying low. You also have to defend the worst case scenario under your side of the house. If their impact is so big and so harmful, why are you still okay for allowing them to go, to not being able to provide any mechanizations on your side of the house? But secondly, they also kill thousands of people through unregulated drug distributions, for example. So even if they're not doing violations directly to people on the ground, or they don't become aggressive under their side of the house, it's still impacting these people's life, right? Because you disallow them for being a functional member of society. You make them reliant on this drug, recreational drug, and disallow them to have a good life. But lastly, they support government corruptions such as money laundering, for example, or giving corruption. So they are actually participating in this macro level of how government operates and how they're becoming even worse under their side of the house, right? So in conclusions, regardless of their multiple difference in terms of ISIS, and also drug cartel in Mexico, intention, as long as we can prove to you that the impact to society is big, they could still be characterized as terrorist group, because that's what should be the purpose. That's what indicates the level of punishment that we give should be be based on the impacts to what that this group gave, instead of just what are the intentions, politicals or like materialistic goods and whatnot, regardless of their association with businesses, for example, or with government. If they're able, if they have created this such a huge impact towards people on the ground, and creating a bad regulations in the society, we say that they're a part of terrorist groups. I think one of the strongest difference that closing opposition bring in this debate is talking about like society backlash and whatnot, right? They're talking about on how that currently society is very reliant, and the moment we're going to eliminate this group, you're going to have society that doesn't believe in law and regulations. I really, really don't understand, right? Because to some extent, a lot of people on the ground, for example, some of them do use drugs and become a target and victim of this organization, but some also does not, right? Because we need to debate in a fair characterizations of how this people work. Because some of them, for example, have moralities in terms of their religions, or they do not want to opt into doing drugs, or they're just like pure in of itself or innocent. Therefore, they're not opting into this kind of crimes, right? We said that there's also a big amount of number of people who have this kind of narrative, right? What does it mean? It means that they are shamed for it, the moral justice that allows you to really think when you're opting into this more crimes organizations, for example. You feel guilty, you feel shame. There are level of shames because you're for example harming other people's life when you're opting into violence missions, for example, and you have to kill people when you become a part of that member. There are level of guilt that exists under your side of the house, right? So I think this is not going to be a social justice movement suddenly. Under their side of the house, people will uprise against the government because they're so bad, right? Because there's level of illegality that you kind of determines when you opting into this, and therefore society, there are also a big part of society that already disagree to this kind of narrative to begin with. So they're most likely their demand are not going to, oh, you have to allow these criminal organizations to happen, but to allow government to become better. But it's going to be even worse under their side of the house, right? Because they're under their side of the house, society will always have alternatives, so they cannot push government to create changes even further, right? Because there's other alternatives that are more direct and more, for example, short terms in terms of giving benefits. So under their side of the house, structural change can never happen under their side of the house, right? So in this debate, I'm going to talk about two main actors, right? That all of the teams in the debate agree important. First of all, I'm going to talk about how does this impact the capacity of crime syndicates and civilians, which is like the main argumentation that come from whole opposition bench. OJ talks about all this benefit of being aggressive to criminal syndicates, essentially in order to capture them. But I don't think they really analyze to you why, how does like the process and structural changes can happen under our side of the house, right? We said that this relying on recruitment process are people not believing in these crime syndicates that are reliant to labeling them as terrorist group. Because the moment you label this as terrorist group, for example, a lot of media covered this. You are going to shift the perceptions of people, possible customers, for example, of this buying drugs, or like people who wants to opt in as member of this cartel, for example, or crime syndicates. You make them feel that the moment you're opting into this, you're going to also be involved on ruining other people's life and become a part of terrorist group. We said that this is a very, very hard step for a lot of people to take, right? Because most of them have, for example, other people that justify why this is wrong, for example, or they have a sense of morality that exists since they're very young. So I think at the end of the day, increasing presence of media will make them have the ability to becoming like more incentivized to opting in. What does it mean when you do not have this recruitment, which is very dismissed by closing oppositions, by the way? You take away their income. First, there are three reasons. There are less distributions in the cities, for example, so less reach to the customer. Secondly, people are more afraid of buying from them because they're seen associated as terrorists and risking their life of getting taken away by these officials. And lastly, with the money, they have less incentive to offer civilians to join them, because less funds to train military, less funds for weapons, less money to bribe, right? We said that creating you're structurally damaging them. But even if we take the worst case scenario that are pushed by opening oppositions, what if they go into hiding? It's harder for you to thrive. We say that this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because getting into hiding means that they are lessening their transactions, for example, or capacity to expand. So under the risk accusations towards us, we're okay with that. But secondly, talking about why civilians harm or like mostly suffers, they talk about on how that syndicates become aggressive and attacking people. This isn't exclusionary, because the way these groups operate is already very, very violent, right? They operate through intimidations and fear, for example, when your members does not fulfill the the parameter of like selling products that they give, there's a possibility for you to kill them or to do violence towards them, right? So under their side of the house, consistent violence can exist because this group operates on intimidation and fear, and also scared if they're like being taken away by officials, so they become even more aggressive. This is not an exclusionary benefit that comes under their side of the house. Therefore, because of that reasons, we cannot rely civilians relying on this type of syndicates to closing government.
All right. I think that's
one. Let's just do a bit of weighing and a bit of summarization of like what has actually happened, right? So first, what I'm going to be doing is to like explain like what Clary has done in her earlier speech and why that still stands within the debate. Then take out CG, take out OG, and explain why we take this debate over OO. Let me just start. So we think we brought you into this unique frame, right? We told you the point in which this debate is the most important is that the point, like the reason why this debate even happens is assuming that the reason why you're unable to prosecute organized crime syndicates in the absence of calling them terrorist groups is the point in which there's some level of state failure or there's some level of weakness and decentralization within the states in terms of its public administration. We told you that insofar that the state is weak, that having like this sort of a weak state, right, is the reason why like clearance extension is so important, because like, you need to be able to maintain the institutions of justice rather than just outright calling people terrorist groups, because we don't think the state is intrinsically weak, right? But it's not about being intrinsically weak in terms of like they don't have democracy or they don't have like being able to stand for elections, for example. But it's more like there's a lot of distrust between the people and between the state, which is why law enforcement oftentimes like can be bought over, which is what OG and CG like bought over by these crime syndicates, right? We think in clearance extension, we told you that the importance of prosecuting them through the legitimacy of the justice system does two things. A, it's the best way to wean off support, right? When people see joining the organized crime syndicates as having like real life repercussions, that acts as the best form of deterrence. But second, that the ability of the law to prosecute is what's going to win back faith in people. Because assuming that the state has the reasonable ability, like according to Prop Fiat, the reasonable ability to prosecute once they become terrorist groups, it means that there's still some level of control that the state has, right? But we think that that means that there's also probably political will and political capital to like prosecute them right now. We think this wins back trust in state institutions and state structures. We think the impact, and this directly deals with the entire government case, is that they become even more radicalized because of the fear of their livelihood and their existence being threatened. Let me explain why this takes out the entire CG's neck. CG's premise and the way in which they entered the debate was to explain that all their material hinges on people not joining these organized crime syndicates the moment in which they're labeled terrorist groups because of some sort of like signaling effect of being labeled a terrorist group. First level of response, then why is it that people still join things like ISIS or Boko Haram or Al-Qaeda, even though after they were labeled as terrorist groups? Like we argue that like the point at which ISIS became an international threat is when they, or like international terrorist group, and when they got even more media coverage, right? It's the point at which they actually started to be able to like recruit more followers from people all over the world. We think this takes out the harm on CG. But what's the impact on three main levels? We think one, this means that under like both sides, right, the problem on the ground is still not solved. This is worse under CG side and under gov bench because there are still people who exist within the organized crime syndicates, right? And this makes it even harder for these people to leave. So the people who would otherwise have been like who otherwise like your lower level like lackeys or your runners, for example, people who like law enforcement or people who have been more easy to like bait them into like taking plea bargains or getting them like when you catch them on the ground for actually like possession of drugs, for example, rather like possession of drugs and being able to bring them in and identify like and organize like plea bargains, for example, was like better on our side of the house, because then the justice system could have like crack some deals, be able to actually deal with the whole hierarchy and the whole system of how organized crime syndicates happen, rather than like just turning them to terrorist groups where there's no level of like discussion. You immediately have to jail these people and criminalize them. Second is that we think that they become even more violent. We think this is incredibly important because they have more to lose by like, we think that the point at which you label them a terrorist group doesn't remove the power that they have, right? But it makes them like more likely to be violent because now they have more to lose by going to jail. There's a fear of death, right? So the mentality becomes like from just like an organized crime syndicate that wants to make money to one in which that says you either kill and you either evade the police as far as you can, or be like you either kill or be killed. See, these alternatives to them is just to kill. It's like to give them no trial, no room, no like nothing, right? Except just to criminalize them and criminalize their existence. But weekly, you also lose out on all the benefits that you can actually get at cracking down on crime through things like plea bargains or people at the lower levels. We think this mentality that you end up creating by labeling them a terrorist group is exactly what's going to radicalize them. And this is why it's so important that what Clarine told you about, right? Because if their MEC relies on this idea of a signaling effect, we think that like you don't actually win people on the ground. And like, why is this so important? We think this, so whatever I'm going to say, we'll take up OG's material as well. We think on the ground, if you look at a state in which like organized crime syndicates actually have so much power, is one in which like the people have to somewhat like them, or people have to somewhat buy into the level of protection that they're offering them that the state does not offer, right? These organized crime syndicates come in and fill that sort of vacuum. So we think that if there's no meaningful difference to people on the ground, right, like that you can label them something different the next day, but the things that they're still doing for people, like providing social services, or the things like operating schools, for example, which they do in Italy with the mafia, like which is why the Catholic Church actually used to back them up, because they provided social services that the state didn't provide. We think this is the point at which that there's no meaningful difference and you don't actually win people over on outside of the house, because they still see that these people are doing some good for them, while the state that these people already civilians already distrust is just taking away their only source of livelihood or taking away their only source of social services. But before I continue, I'll take a POI from OG.
For something to be a syndicate, it has to be a large operation. We gave you incentives for why they are likely to be violent and create an atmosphere of fear. The justice system stays more consistent when it labels them and terrorists the same way, irrespective of futile outcomes. What is that framing?
Let me go on to OG. So we think that the thing that OG doesn't do within this debate, right, is to meet the burden of being able to label something a terrorist group. The comparison we gave you in Clarine is that the aims of an organized crime syndicate is one in which that they're more motivated by money when they try to sell weapons to to sell weapons, for example, for gangs to fight other gangs, versus that of a terrorist group, right? Because we think terrorist groups are incredibly motivated by ideology. Governments, OG's entire assertion in this debate and how they entered was to say that crime syndicates are bad. Therefore, we should label them at the highest level of severity that we can in order to try and prosecute them. No reason why you need to do that beyond that they're just dangerous and somehow the state cannot do these things. If the state cannot do these things, right, or cannot even bring in other sources, then there's no way that they could have prosecuted them even as a terrorist group if they're really so powerful and the state is really so weak. Then we don't understand how they win this debate. But by their logic, social justice movements that even use a little bit of violence, right, or whoever throws the first stone, for example, should just be labeled as a terrorist group, which is ridiculous. I want to take out OG in this debate, right? So that OG's case explains that the state needs to protect people and therefore should employ this policy. But this negated by the analysis coming up from Clarine's extension about how you need stable judicial structures and judicial structures that people can believe in, judicial structures that show that the power of state enforcement is real in this country. Takes out all the material on this idea about protection, right? Because we think that we do, they say that people have this perception of feeling harm, right? We say that, first of all, if the media tends to blow this up, we think this is when these groups actually become to that level of being radicalized. But this negates everything that we tell you about why prosecuting them through the justice system was going to be the most important within this debate, and as well the idea of state failure. For all these reasons, extremely proud to oppose.